Good. How are you?
I want to welcome everyone in this brisk fall day. It feels really good to me. I don't know about you, and sort of a big wake up in the morning, isn't it? I'm Kathy Sherman. I'm the Executive Director of Hillside School. Hillside is a school specifically for dyslexic kids. It's a half-day program. You're welcome to get on our website. If you want more information, you're also welcome to call me directly and just talk about your kid. It's a complex world, I think, in education these days and raising kids. So I try to make myself available just to listen and help you problem solve if I'm able to do that, and maybe suggest someone else that might also be able to help. So please reach out if you need to do that. I'm very excited about our program today. We are in a little different space because we anticipated a large group. Kristen Powell and Jill Alloy are both pediatric neuropsychologists in our area, Boulder, and I consider them at the top of that professional group, and their expertise is invaluable. So we're excited to have them here speaking with us about this very complex topic of executive function, and I'm eager to hear all that they have to say. I also want to let you know with our Hill Topics program, we are having a practical session in January in the evening, and I believe that's the 17th of January. It's for parents and kids, middle school and up, not elementary, but it's a practical, hands-on ways to work with executive function, really helping kids learn how to do school, and that will be with Brandon Slade. You can also Google him for more information. Next month, November 13th, I will be speaking on dyslexia and learning. That's a landscape that continues to change and grow, and new information is flowing all the time in that area. So it is exciting in the world of neuroscience. So I welcome you all. I'd like to suggest if you have questions during the presentation that are general, please go ahead and ask those questions at that point in time that they're pertinent. Personal questions we welcome toward the end when we are wrapping up. So I'm glad to see you all here, and I'll turn it over to Jill and Kristen right now.
Thank you, Kathy, for that warm welcome. I really appreciate seeing so many faces, including a few familiar faces out here on this cold fall morning in Boulder, which is somewhat characteristic for us right now. So, as Kathy said, this is a complex topic, and it is going to take two of us to do justice to this topic. Thank you. It's going to take two of us to do justice to this topic. We're going to split the talk in half. So I'm going to begin by talking with you about a couple of things really kind of having to do with the general aspects of what are executive functions and why would neuropsychologists be interested in something like executive functions. And then Dr. Alloy will pick up about halfway through and talk with you about some other conditions that are affected by and related to executive function problems, and also about interventions. So by the end, we will be really focusing, I think, more intently on the issues around intervention, and that's a great time to be thinking about questions having to do with, well, what do you do about this, or what do you do about that? So those kind of questions are probably best to stay to the end. So just as an overview, some take-home messages for today. This is what you can expect to hear about. So what are executive functions? We'll start with some basic definitions and descriptions. Why are some kids better at some executive functions than others? How do you learn about your own child's executive functions? What is the field of neuropsychology, and what does it have to say about executive functions? What other kinds of difficulties are related to executive functions? And that's where Dr. Alloy will be picking up. And how can I help my child or teen strengthen their executive functions in particular? So I just want to begin by asking a real quick question, taking a little survey about people's familiarity with this concept. So the term executive functions is now out there in the world a little bit more than it used to be, say 5 or 10 years ago. And I know for certain there are some people in this audience that know a whole heck of a lot about executive functions and actually work with executive functions in kids. So there are some experts here, and I'm guessing there are some novices. Could I get, first of all, a show of hands of all the people who feel like they understand what the term executive function means and you know, work with that or are pretty fluent with that concept? All right, so that might be about a third or maybe even half of the audience. That's good to hear. How many of you are completely new to the term executive function? This is the first time you're really saying, like, we got to find out about this. Okay, a few folks. And how many of you are somewhere in the middle? You sort of have a sense of what it is, but you're looking to get more information, more specific. Okay, good. That helps me gauge where we are in terms of introducing people to concepts. So, so why do we need to demystify executive functions? That is the title of our talk, and there's a reason for that. Whenever we talk about executive functions in clinical practice, we start out by saying, so have you heard the term executive functions? And we expect these days that a lot of people will have heard that term, but we don't always expect that they know what that means in the same sense that we're talking about it. So that's probably because at least one study out there has found that there are over 30 definitions of what executive functions are in the literature. So it really depends a lot on what you're reading and where you're looking and who you're thinking about when you think about executive functions. What your concept of that might be. The term is really used very differently in different contexts. So in the field of education, there are very specific ways that it's talked about, especially things having to do with organization and planning and working memory. Those sort of things are very familiar in the field of education. In business, the concept of executive function is getting more attention these days. So some folks come in and they say, well, I know what executive functions are because we talk about it in the workplace. But that's not quite what we mean when we talk about executive functions as neuropsychologists. The term executive function actually comes from the field of neuropsychology. It was derived as a way of describing certain aspects of brain function at a very, very basic neurological level. So when we talk about executive functions, we're really talking about mechanisms in the brain that contribute to problems with organization or problems with planning or time management. So we're going to talk about things on both levels today, but I just want to be very specific that we're going to be talking some neuro today, and we're also going to be talking some education, not so much the business part. And then the term executive function also means it covers a pretty diverse range of cognitive functions that are as different as inhibiting impulsive responses and planning and organizing and managing time. And those are some pretty different concepts, although they are very much interrelated and depend upon, one depends upon the other, the more basic. So let me just see how this shows up. Can people see the orange okay? Is that showing up for you? Okay. All right, well, I'm going to be describing what's up there, so if it's hard to read, I'll be, is that better? All right, great, thank you. So I'm sure that many of you have heard this, this metaphor before. The brain's conductor, as in the conductor of an orchestra or a symphony, or the CEO as the metaphor for what are executive functions. So the conductor of the orchestra is lovely because it's this idea that there is some kind of person in the system that's keeping everything humming together harmoniously. And when everything is humming together, behavior is more seamless and better organized. But the CEO is in some ways a better metaphor because it is really it's very specific, it's very workable in terms of describing what the executive functions are all about. What do the executive functions do for our lives? So what does a CEO do? Well, a CEO, I read my own notes here. A CEO engages in goal setting and prioritizing. Here, I'm going to come around for this part. These are all things that our executive functions do for us. Can you hear me if I'm sitting here? All right, so integration of information coming in from diverse sources outside of the company and within a company. A CEO manages a lot of information, integrates it, and then prioritizes what's the most important information and puts together a plan for how to deal with all that information. Planning, time and resource management, performance monitoring, keeping an eye on how things are working. If things aren't working, changing the plan. So that is what it looks like in a company when a CEO is running a company. In an individual, we're talking about executive functions being those brain functions, those cognitive functions that are involved in regulating the organism in a lot of different ways, at a lot of different levels. So this involves the regulation of different neurological systems so that they can interact and perform their roles efficiently. It's a lot about efficiency. Executive functions include different aspects of self-control, attention, organization, and problem solving. That's the kind of executive functions that you probably know about when you're thinking about academic or educational applications. Mood regulation is another form of executive function, and we say that because the parts of the brain that are involved in regulating cognition and behavior are connected to or adjacent to, related to the parts of the brain that are involved in regulating mood and emotion. So we think about self-regulation as having three kind of general levels. And when we talk with families about executive functions in their child's development, we're always really very cognizant that these are three separate sets of issues that are each complex in their own right. So the regulation of cognition, or different aspects of thinking and problem solving, the regulation of emotion, managing emotional stimulation and modulating emotions smoothly and effectively, and behavior, so behavior and impulse control, that sort of thing. So I've referenced the brain. I'm guessing that many of you already know which part of the brain I might be referring to when I think about the executive in the brain. So the executive functions are the brain's command, control, and monitoring systems. And we like to think of those as kind of like a top-down control system, as you might see in a company where the CEO is at the top of the company and is making decisions about how everybody else kind of lower down in the system is going to be contributing and working together. So what's at the top in the brain? What's at the top is the frontal lobe. Oftentimes also referred to as the prefrontal lobe, because it's the part that's way out at the very front of the frontal lobe, ahead of the motor region of the brain. The motor control region is very much interconnected with the prefrontal region, which is the more cognitive region of that frontal cortex. So, like a CEO, the frontal lobe's goal is managing or regulating the organism efficiently. And so how do the frontal lobes work their magic? How do they do what they do? People, when they talk about executive functions, often just say, well, it's the frontal lobe's job. But a CEO doesn't get anything done in a company without the rest of the company pulling together. And the frontal lobe doesn't really do anything unless it's talking to the other regions of the brain. And the regions that it talks to, well, the frontal lobe actually talks to just about every other region of the brain there is. There are bidirectional connections between all sorts of brain regions and the frontal lobe in order to get a bunch of information into the frontal lobe so that it can integrate that information and send out ideas and commands to the rest of the brain. That's that top-down control concept. So one of the most important things to know, however, is that the top-down control is very much sort of actualized through the motor system. So the frontal subcortical circuits, and by subcortical circuits I just mean underneath the cortex. Those are the parts of the brain that have a lot to do with motor control and movement. So those frontal and subcortical circuits, the frontal lobe's connections to those underlying regions, allow us to exercise control over movement, mood, behavior, cognition. I'm emphasizing the motor piece in this case because people tend to think of executive functions and movement or motor control as completely separate issues, when in fact they are intimately connected. It's very important to remember that we don't behave without the motor system. stop for a minute and think about that. Try to behave without your movement system. You can't move your eyes, you can't move your lips, you can't speak, you can't move your body, or you can't keep your body still without a well-regulated movement system. So one of the most important things to understand about the way the frontal lobe works is that it works by regulating other brain regions and by being connected to other brain regions. And that's going to be important in Dr. Aloya's talk too, where she's going to talk about other issues that stem from executive function problems, not just the frontal lobe issues. So many kids who have executive function problems, when they get to late elementary, middle school, high school, start out showing their issues with self-regulation vis-a-vis the motor system. So a lot of the kids that we see started out having trouble with fine motor control, or even gross motor control, that they may be a little slow to walk or a little slow to speak. So we ask a lot of questions, even when your child is in college. If we're evaluating a child, we ask a lot of questions about when did they start to walk, how did they start to write, what were their early motor development sorts of issues like. So, in addition to being connected to these subauricular motor regions by neuronal connections, by brain cells, the executive functions are powered by neurotransmitters. So one of the things we're also going to talk a little bit about is the way in which neurotransmitters play a role in powering some of the executive functions. Most particularly, the neurotransmitter that you might hear about the most out there is dopamine. It's the neurotransmitter that has the most to do with things like alertness, motivation, a sense of reward or engagement in an activity. So for those of you who know what it's like to work with a child who has executive function issues, there's clearly something going on with dopamine in kids who just have trouble getting started, getting organized, staying focused, staying on task, regulating consistently their focus and energy level and engagement level. So dopamine is critical for motivation, and that's that feeling of feeling good about what you've done, or feeling like you want to sit down and do an activity. It also fuels the motor system. So our motor system is heavily reliant upon dopamine, and you may know of conditions like Parkinson's in which there is a declining dopamine later in life when there are symptoms that are also executive in nature. So dopamine is important, and that's the only transmitter I'm going to spend time talking about, but other neurotransmitters are important as well, and as is norepinephrine, which is involved to some extent in focus and arousal and energy, and serotonin, which is involved in mood and a sense of pleasure and engagement. So at the cognitive level, when we're talking about when do executive functions come into play the most, one of the most important things to know about kids' executive functions when they're learning is that these executive functions are super important when you're learning new information. When you've already got a skill or a task mastered, like you already learned to read, you know how to read. You can read the words on the page. You don't have to try to read the words. But when you're learning how to read the words on the page, this is a novel task, and it takes effort and motivation and focus. It takes boring repetition, and it takes the willingness to tolerate frustration and errors in order to stick with it and keep going. And those are all things that have to do with executive functions, and Dr. Aloya is going to talk with you some more about that. But when a child is learning a new task, if they have inconsistent executive functions, that's one of those times that you're going to see these issues, their struggles come out the most, when they sit down to learn something new. Controlling that brain to make it do something it doesn't yet know how to do is challenging. And you're going to hear us talk about tasks that are effortful. So I think we all know that kids with executive function issues can do a lot of things well. They can focus on things if they're interested, if they're stimulating, if they're fun. But tasks that are effortful are very different. So spelling, for example, is a whole lot different than video gaming. And so kids don't enjoy spelling quite as much as they might enjoy video gaming, and one of them gives them a nice big hit of dopamine, and that's not spelling. And spelling doesn't give them so much. They gotta bring their own dopamine to bear on those spelling words that they're studying. So as kids learn their spelling and their reading and their math, the necessity of the executive functions getting involved in the learning process goes down over time. So new learning, novelty, new situations, lots of need for those executive functions to be regulating the organism, keeping it focused, keeping it engaged. And this is one of the reasons why many kids with significant executive function problems really struggle with change, transitions, novelty, new situations, have a lot of anxiety when they have to transition between things, and really rely very heavily on familiarity, routine, structure, etc. And Dr. O'Leary will return to that. So I think many folks may already know that kids with very obvious behavior control problems are showing some signs of executive dysfunction. In other words, they're having trouble sitting still or inhibiting their impulses. But other signs of inefficiency or underactivity or underengagement of the executive function system include more subtle issues that look like boredom or low motivation. So underachievement, low frustration tolerance, avoiding tasks that are effortful and demanding, procrastinating, forgetfulness, disorganization, slow processing speed, anxiety about performance. These are all signs that there's a little bit of the executive system is a little hinky, I like to say. It's not necessarily a disorder or a diagnosis, it's just a little hinky. It's not fully under the control of the child that's struggling to stay plugged in. So, some conditions that involve inefficient development of executive functions, and we're mostly talking about developmental disorders today, or developmental issues in kids who have executive function problems. This would be a different and much, much longer list if we were talking about issues later in life that involve executive function problems, dementias and that sort of thing. But these are really developmental conditions in this case. So, important thing to know is that just about every developmental disorder that we work with involves some kind of executive function problem, but it varies from one condition to the next in terms of which of the executive functions it hits hardest. So ADHD is the prototypical condition involving executive dysfunction, and if neuropsychologists instead of psychiatrists had named that condition, we would have called it executive function disorder, probably not attention deficit disorder, because most kids with ADHD can pay attention to some things, but they cannot routinely engage in consistent executive control. So all kinds of genetic and chromosomal disorders involve different kinds of executive function problems. Certainly kids with different kinds of epilepsy, brain injuries, mood disorders like depression and bipolar disorder involve some dysregulation of the mood system. This was my dissertation, was on bipolar disorder and executive functions in that particular condition. Schizophrenia, anxiety disorders, obsessive compulsive disorder, dyslexia, a class of disorders called nonverbal learning disabilities. We probably could go on, but that gives you an idea that whenever you're dealing with a condition that involves difficulty self-regulating at some level, there's probably some other executive function problems going on there. So I'm going to move along a little bit faster now that I'm looking at the time. And this is essentially the point that I made on the last slide. So different developmental conditions affect different executive functions differently. So ADHD may affect inhibition, I'm going to talk about that in a minute, or working memory, we'll talk about that too in a minute, very specifically, as well as things like planning and focusing. Autism spectrum conditions often affect something called mental flexibility, or the ability to shift fluidly between activities and settings and contexts. So there is a tremendous amount of overlap, or what's called comorbidity, and that's a kind of a yucky word that means two disorders that are occurring in a single individual. So sometimes the diagnosis is both an autism spectrum or Asperger's kind of disorder and ADHD, rather than is it this or is it that. Sometimes it's one and not the other. The only way you find out is to do a thorough assessment where you look at all the variables. So ADHD is the prototypical disorder of executive function, and I'm going to talk about that for just a few minutes here because it really illustrates some of these executive, the actual functions themselves pretty clearly. So ADHD is both a disorder and a delay in development. And that point is essentially, a way of saying that there are real identifiable neurological problems and deficits in kids struggling with the characteristics of ADHD. So we also know that it affects the neurotransmitter systems, which is why it responds to medications that are dopaminergic and that sort of thing. It's also a delay, however, and that's a little bit of good news because we're finding more and more that the brain systems in kids with ADHD eventually start catching up as they move through adolescence. They catch up best if that ADHD is caught early and treated early, and the brains of kids that are treated early and consistently structured throughout their development end up looking much more like kind of neurotypical kids without developmental disorders by the time they get to late adolescence, which is in their 20s. So yes, it is quite a delay. It's not just a short delay, it's quite a delay. But really early and solid, consistent treatment makes a big difference in how typical development looks over time. So in general, executive functions include this list of the following things. Inhibition or inhibiting impulses, working memory, and I'm going to define that in just a minute, so especially more active working memory, complex and spatial working memory, flexible regulation of attention, in other words, kind of getting yourself to do it when you're supposed to do it, not just whenever you feel like it, shifting attention, sustaining focus, resisting and filtering out distractions, monitoring or assessing and keeping track of the quality and accuracy of tasks, self-monitoring of interpersonal behavior. So being aware that when you are fidgeting in class, it's annoying all the kids near you, or being aware that when you punch kids in class, it's actually annoying the kids that you're punching. A lot of kids are not aware of the impact that their behavior has on others. So we talk about that as self-monitoring as opposed to task monitoring. And executive planning, which is what a lot of folks work on with older kids who have executive function problems, that breaking tasks down into smaller units, prioritizing, organizing time management. These things build upon one another. So inhibition is a very, very basic core executive function. And I think we all probably by this point have a sense of what that means. The ability to put the brakes on when you need to put the brakes on, to not hit that kid in your classroom just because they said something really, truly mean, even though you really want to hit them and they really deserve it. You probably should put on the brakes. So inhibiting impulses, inhibiting automatic reactions to things, being able to kind of keep your focus on your schoolwork even though something else is happening that might be more interesting in the classroom or in the home. And poor motor inhibition, or the limited ability to control the motor system, looks like hyperactivity. So squirmy kids have trouble keeping that motor system quiet and in control and focused. That's why they're squirming. So this is one of the characteristics at the root of the kind of prototypical combined type, so hyperactive, impulsive, and inattentive ADHD. And here we have the symptoms. So this is probably familiar: impulsivity, hyperactivity, fidgeting. This is what we think of as ADHD, but ADHD has another subtype, which is the predominantly inattentive subtype that doesn't have those hyperactive and impulsive symptoms so much. And working memory is at the core of that in many cases, not all cases. We see a lot of kids who have pretty decent working memory, but have a hard time with higher level executive skills like planning and organizing. Working memory is an important concept though, so I'm just going to spend about a minute really focusing on working memory. So working memory is that mental blackboard that we have where we can calculate the tip, or we can hold a series of directions in order to get us from one side of town to the other without writing it down. Working memory helps us hold numbers, lists, verbal, visual directions in mind while we're using them. We don't want to keep that around forever, so it's not like learning in memory. We don't want everything that comes into our working memory system on our blackboard to stay in our brain forever, or we would never forget anything and we would have very messy brains. So we want working memory to just hold it there long enough to use it and then get rid of it so it can be cleared for the next thing that needs to be held in mind. It is important for mental arithmetic, sequencing, planning. And in ADHD, it is very often at the root of some of the